Hey there, in today's video we are going to go over all about the particulars, the standards when it comes to drivers, commercial drivers who have a history of either epilepsy or having seizures. Now, I think it goes without saying, but there are going to be some pretty strict rules and regulations when it comes to diagnosis of epilepsy or previous seizures, and I think this is obvious. What the FMCSA is trying to prevent is accidents in large vehicles because they can be very catastrophic, and obviously having a seizure, having an event where you lose consciousness while driving a big piece of machinery, again, could have disastrous effects. I've told this story before in the past. I will just real briefly. Again, a couple years ago, I'm in the Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky area, a bridge connecting Cincinnati to Northern Kentucky. A truck was driving, an 18-wheeler was driving on this bridge. It wrecked. It basically blew the bridge up. We couldn't use the bridge for over a year. It was a mess. It was a nightmare. And again, I don't know if this was due to a medical condition, but that's the kind of situation that the FMCSA is going to try to prevent. So let's talk about the seizure standard, the seizure and epilepsy standard, and I'm going to read right from the FMCSA's website. Before I do, please, if you are someone that does need to go through medicals either for their work or hobby or for military, etc., or drug testing, please stay subscribed to this video, because when those standards change, I make update videos. I don't want people going into their pre-employment medicals or medicals for any other reason and having any surprises. So please stay subscribed here. And if you like this type of content, please hit that thumbs up button, because I want more people to be able to see this type of information and become informed themselves. And hitting that thumbs up button does help the YouTube algorithm show this to more people. All right, let's look at the FMCSA standards again for seizures and for epilepsy. All right, so again, this is right from the FMCSA website, so I'll read through it and then I'll give you my interpretation and how I perform a DOT physical. So, a person is physically qualified to drive a commercial motor vehicle if that person has no established medical history or clinical diagnosis of epilepsy or any other condition which is likely to cause the loss of consciousness or loss of ability to control a motor vehicle. And the following drivers cannot be qualified. So these are disqualifying factors. Number one is a driver who has a medical history of epilepsy, so has been diagnosed with epilepsy in the past. And then number two is a driver who has a current diagnosis of epilepsy. So I don't know really why they repeated this standard. It's basically the same standard. If you've got any previous or current diagnosis of epilepsy, it is disqualifying. Now, there are going to be federal exemptions, and we will go over this in a little bit here, but these are disqualifying if you walk in to take your DOT physical and you put down epilepsy or previous diagnosis of epilepsy in your paperwork, then we are going to not be able to qualify you, unfortunately. And number three is a driver who is taking any anti-seizure medication. And this one especially is one that I see a lot. People come in and list certain medications. Now, medications can do different things. An anti-seizure medication, a medication that's given for seizures, a seizure condition, can be used for another condition as well. So just because you're taking a particular medication that can be used for seizures does not mean that you follow under this third standard, a driver taking anti-seizure medication. If you're not taking it for seizures, I will not interpret that as disqualifying and will not disqualify you for that. So there's a number of different medications. Again, I'm not going to go through all of them, but if you list a medication that can be used for seizures, but it's not prescribed for seizures, then this third standard will not apply. All right, and let's read on further. If an individual has a sudden episode of a non-epileptic seizure or loss of consciousness of unknown cause, which did not require anti-seizure medication, again, what they are looking for is either epilepsy or taking anti-seizure medication specifically. The decision as to whether that person's condition will likely cause the loss of consciousness or loss of ability to control a motor vehicle is made on an individual basis by the medical examiner, by us. and in consultation with the treating physician. So before certification, this is important. Before certification is considered, it is suggested that a 6-month waiting period elapse from the time of the episode, and following that waiting period, it is suggested that the individual have a complete neurological evaluation. So what this standard particularly means, or what this paragraph particularly means, is we are given some latitude. We are able to use our best judgment. Now again, we're not going to qualify people. I'm not going to qualify anybody that I think potentially could have another seizure or lose consciousness, because again, that can be a catastrophic situation. But this is not an absolutely disqualifying scenario. If you have had a seizure in the past, the medical examiner, we are going to be able to use our best judgment to see if we are able to qualify you. But they are suggesting, the FMCSA is suggesting, it's again not required, that 6 months at least pass from the time you've had that seizure, you lost consciousness, and after that 6 months has gone by, you have an evaluation by a neurologist and he clears you. And I will require that in my office. So even though it's not absolutely required by the FMCSA, they're making this as a recommendation. This is something that I take very, very seriously, and I think most other providers will as well. So again, make sure that at least 6 months has passed before or after you've had your event, after you've lost consciousness or had a seizure. 6 months has passed and you walk into that DOT physical with clearance from your neurologist. Very important. All right, and then we'll move on and we'll read a little bit further. In individual cases where a driver has a seizure or episode of loss of consciousness that resulted from a known medical condition like a drug reaction, certification should be deferred until the driver has fully recovered from that condition. And again, I will require clearance from a neurologist in this particular case and has no existing residual complications. Again, the neurologist would have to clear you. And very important, is not taking medication to control their seizure condition. All right, and then moving on, here's where the FMCSA gives us an exception to that absolutely no anti-seizure medication epilepsy diagnosis rule. So drivers with a history of epilepsy or seizures off of anti-seizure medication. So you need to be off of your medication that is controlling the epilepsy or the seizures, off anti-seizure medication and seizure-free for 10 years. You have to be seizure-free for 10 years, may be qualified to drive a commercial motor vehicle in interstate commerce. Interstate drivers with a history of a single unprovoked seizure, one seizure, may be qualified to drive a commercial motor vehicle interstate commerce if seizure-free and off anti-seizure medication for a 5-year period. So if you did have to take anti-seizure medication, you only had one episode, you need to be off that anti-seizure medication and seizure-free for 5 years. So history of epilepsy, a history or diagnosis of epilepsy, you will need to be seizure-free and off anti-seizure medication for 10 years, but if you only had one seizure, one event, you need to be off of that anti-seizure medication for 5 years. So referring to seizure disorders, epilepsy diagnosis, if there is a seizure disorder epilepsy diagnosis, the applicant should be seizure-free for 8 years. Now remember, there was a 10-year waiting period for the medical examiner to be able to clear you if you've got a history of epilepsy. But under the federal exemption rule, this can be lowered by 2 years to 8 years, and this is on or off medication. And again, remember, for the medical examiner to evaluate you and be able to certify you, you had to be off your medication. So there is more grace here, but you do have to apply for a federal exemption. If the individual is taking anti-seizure medication, this is important, the plan for medication should be stable for 2 years, meaning the medication is not being changed or manipulated for 2 years straight. And again, stable means no changes in medication, dosage, or frequency of medication administration. And then the recertification for drivers with an epilepsy diagnosis should be performed every year, meaning you're going to get a 1-year medical card. So let's say you had a single unprovoked seizure. So if there is a single unprovoked seizure, there's no known trigger for the seizure, the individual should be seizure-free for 4 years. So they're lowering that standard that the medical examiner can evaluate and certify you for by 1 year. Remember, you need to be seizure-free for 5 years and off your medication. And then again, this is on or off medication, so you can be taking the anti-seizure medication. It's just you cannot be certified directly by the medical examiner. You have to have this federal exemption go along with your medical card. If the individual is taking anti-seizure medication, again, the plan for the medication should be stable for 2 years, and recertification for drivers with a single unprovoked seizure can be performed every 2 years, so you can qualify for a 2-year card. And then finally, and this one gets a little bit more complicated, a single provoked seizure, meaning something happened, an event happened that triggered the seizure. So if there is a single provoked seizure, again, this is to file for a federal exemption, so there's a known reason for the seizure. The agency will consider specific criteria that fall into the following 2 categories: low risk factors for reoccurrence and moderate to high risk factors for reoccurrence. So it's going to be more likely, if you fall into the low risk category, that you're going to be granted this federal exemption. Now, I don't know, it's possible that you could still get a federal exemption if you fall into the moderate to high risk category, but let's go over both categories here. All right, so examples of low-risk factors for reoccurrence include seizures that were caused by medication, by non-penetrating head injury, with a loss of consciousness less than a half an hour, less than 30 minutes, brief loss of consciousness not likely to recur while driving, by a metabolic condition, again, not likely to reoccur, or by alcohol or drug withdrawal. So those are all examples of low risk factors for reoccurrence. All right, so the examples of moderate to high risk factors for reoccurrence include seizures caused by non-penetrating head injury, again with a loss of consciousness of greater than 30 minutes, or a penetrating head injury, intracerebral hemorrhage associated with a stroke or a trauma, infections, intracranial hemorrhage, post-operative complication from brain surgery with significant brain hemorrhage, brain tumor, or stroke. So if you're going to apply for a federal exemption and you meet the above criteria, then you submit an application to be considered for an exemption. First, the agency must make a thorough review of your medical records and any other documents that would support your request for an exemption from this regulation. So I hope this video was very straightforward. Again, the FMCSA is going to take the loss of consciousness while driving a large vehicle very, very serious. If you fall into one of those categories, please either know that before going in to take your DOT physical, or know what to do in order to try to obtain a federal exemption. All right, until next time, everybody, stay safe.